From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
President Biden and former President Trump say they're up to debate each other as Trump wraps up another week in court. We'll get reaction to the testimony we've heard so far in the hush money trial with former White House counsel Cobb.
The Pentagon announcing $6 billion in weapons for Ukraine just days after foreign aid made it from Congress to the president's desk. We'll have more on the effort with Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas.
And fresh inflation data today reinforces the Fed's higher for longer message, with consumer sentiment taking a hit. Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, will join us this hour. So, Joe, clearly a busy day in terms of the economy, a lot for Wall Street to pay attention to and a lot to captivate Washington as well, as certainly the economy and politics right now are not really able to be extracted from each other.
Well, that's for sure. It's been interesting this week, trying to cover news here in the Capitol with an eye on New York, where so much has been happening, from Donald Trump in a courtroom, Joe Biden there for a number of reasons, campaigning, showing up in a Howard Stern interview today. And all of this, Kaylee, has been against the backdrop of these massive student protests at Columbia University. It's all happening in New York for some reason this week.
Yeah, it does seem to be that New York is the center of the universe in many ways. And to your point about this protest, that is something that is problematic for Biden as he considers trying to continue to court these young voters who are unhappy with this policy around Israel and Gaza. But he has other headaches as well, including some of the economic data we've gotten, softer growth data, hotter inflation data in the last 2 days.
Well, yeah, look, that's the other big story here today. It's playing huge on Wall Street, and we saw a very negative reaction to the data yesterday. A bit of a relief today when we saw the actual monthly PCE data. None of it brings great news, Kaylee, for this White House, though, that, of course, is very concerned about the fight against inflation.
Absolutely. And this is something that we discussed with Mark Zandi over at Moody's earlier today. Take a listen.
Today's data reaffirmed that while inflation remains sticky, it's not coming in quite as fast as everyone would like. It's not hair on fire. It is coming in, and it will continue to come in, over the course of the next several months. So I think everyone's just a bit more relaxed today.
Part of our conversation with Mark Zandi earlier as we try to parse through all of the different data that we have gotten. And we want to get a take now on this economic data from the White House. Jared Bernstein, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, is joining us now. Jared, happy Friday. Thank you so much for being with us on Bloomberg Television and radio this evening. It has been something of a mixed bag. We know that the growth data that came in softer in part had a lot to do with trade, not necessarily that the consumer engine is faltering. But you look at consumer sentiment, and it does suggest that there is concern out there. What can you tell them about the degree of concern they should have?
Well, first of all, consumers should have whatever degree of concern they have. We're not in the business of telling people how they should feel about the economy. It is true that the Michigan sentiment indicator is up 25% since November. We've seen increases, interestingly, among Democrats, Independents, Republicans, and that's been good to see. And I think it's tracked some of the improvements that we saw in inflation, especially the disinflation in the latter half of last year. Now, look, inflation is still down 60% from its peak. It was nice to hit the expectations number for the PCE, both headline and core, this morning. And in terms of the GDP growth, 3% year over year, it is true that there's some noisy sectors there. Inventories is another one, along with net exports. But as long as real consumer spending, fueled by the tight job market and rising real wages, continues to help support consumers in their spending, in their incomes, in their rising disposable incomes, even after inflation, I think that's a good sign for consumers, and probably behind that improvement that we've seen over the longer term sentiment indices.
Well, take us under the hood for a minute here, Jared. It's great to have you back from the North Lawn, by the way. The markets had a bit of a freak out yesterday, and we saw some relief today. But the narrative yesterday was that we've plateaued, that this train's running too hot and inflation is just going to keep on steaming ahead here. Forget interest rate cuts for the rest of the year, and that part may not have changed. But you made an interesting point here. When you start looking at our trade imbalance, net imports and exports, and some of the other noise that created the headline, I wonder how you frame the data from yesterday and where we really are here in the fight against inflation.
I think it's very important to kind of look at as many kind of core or underlying trend indicators as you can. Obviously, core inflation fulfills that role. That's why the Fed elevates it so much. But if you look at the domestic demand measure, PDFP, which, you know, is an acronym for all it means is real consumer spending and real business investment. Now, together, those are more than 80% of nominal GDP, but you can think of that as kind of a core GDP. It's actually a fact that that measure, though combining those two real values, predicts where GDP is going better than GDP itself. And that was up 3.1% in the quarter. We have a blog on that, by the way, on the CEA blog this morning, so check it out. A lot of nice graphics on this point. So look, I think underlying the economy is still as strong as ever. The job market continues to put out great numbers. I don't know if you noticed the initial claims that got a little bit buried on Thursday. I think it was 207,000. I mean, that is a really solid job market number. When it comes to inflation, I think the question there, we should get into it if you want, which is are the forces that helped with the disinflation in the second half of this year, are they just on a break or are they gone? And obviously, we've argued that they are that they're still there and that we expect inflation to continue a bumpy path down towards target.
Well, Mr. Chairman, yeah, we do want to talk more about inflation with you because as you say, there's this question as to whether or not progress is going to continue. And I wonder to what degree you assign progress on the fact that we do have tighter monetary policy right now, that the Fed embarked, and I know you won't comment directly on that policy itself, but that we have seen things tighten substantially in a very short period of time, and we did see inflation come down. We're no longer actively tightening. The Fed's not talking about hiking rates further. So if that doesn't happen, how confident are you that the rest of the way of the inflation progress will actually be made?
Well, look, there's an old kind of rule of thumb that says as inflation comes down, the real interest rate, if you hold Fed policy constant, the real interest rate does get tighter. And we've seen the real interest rate come up significantly over this period. So I think you can't just look at steady as she goes without taking into account some of the moving variables. When it comes to the housing market, which is where, of course, Fed policy always bites first, I mean, there is a really remarkable kind of a gap between the effective mortgage rate, which is the average of all the outstanding mortgages. It's in the 3 to 4% range, and the mortgage rate, you know, that's 7% if you go out and get a new mortgage. That's the lock-in effect right there, that spread. That's a really important kind of overlooked spread. And so I think Fed policy is very much, again, I won't talk about the granular policy, but I think it's incorrect to conclude that it isn't having, you know, an effect or even much of an effect on the economy. Now, I understand the idea that this is another way of saying the neutral interest rate must be higher because, you know, we're posting some great numbers with a relatively high Fed's fund rate. That's a complicated and that's one of those conversations that involves invisible variables. So that's always tricky to talk about. But I do think there's definitely some bite from interest rates.
Jared, there's reporting today that some of Donald Trump's allies are suggesting to him that he restructure the Federal Reserve. And in fact, if were elected again, would make the commander-in-chief, would make the president actually involved in setting interest rate decisions and Fed policy subject essentially to White House approval. You tend to bend yourself into a pretzel to not comment on the Fed, which I realize is kind of the opposite world that you're living in right now. But I just wonder, is that actually something that the president, whether it's yours or any other, could do?
Watch me try to thread a needle here. So look, you've just raised two issues that I can't talk about. One is Federal Reserve monetary policy. The other is, you know, politics. But I'm not going to stay silent on this because I think it's so important. Let me say the following.
Oh boy.
I am a very active reader of the history of monetary policy, and I can spend a long time talking to you about economies that have been brought to their knees when the independence of the central bank has been compromised. That's one of the main reasons why this president takes the stance that he does and follows it assiduously. It's a history that people should think about when evaluating the question you just asked me. Let me just leave that there.
Wow. What do you think?
Pretty decisive from Mr. Chairman.
Jared Bernstein, we thank you for being with us. From the North Lawn, I hope we see you this weekend. Thanks for coming back to talk to us on Bloomberg. Coming up, we'll see a debate between President Biden and Donald Trump after all. We've heard from both of them on this matter today, and we'll get into it next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Welcome to Friday. We just heard from the White House on today's economic data on inflation and economic growth. For how this may play out on the campaign trail with a direct line to Joe Biden, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy. It's great to see you, Gregory. You have a great piece on the terminal today showing how the matter of inflation is overshadowing what is otherwise a very strong economy that this president could otherwise be bragging about. Today's numbers don't help this argument, right?
Yeah, inflation is sort of the albatross here that just won't entirely go away. And this, as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jared Bernstein, just said on the program here, there has been, if you look at it over the past year, there has been progress made, but it's still sticky enough that people aren't quite feeling it. People don't process economic information, especially inflation, in terms of the core inflation rate that Mr. Bernstein was just talking about. Mm-hmm. They think about, okay, what did things cost before the pandemic, and what am I paying for those same things now? Mm. And that's a harder thing for Joe Biden to shake, especially now we are 6 months away from an election. People are really starting to pay attention, and they're really starting to form their opinions about how good this economy is and if they're better off now than they were 4 or 5 years ago.
Well, and President Biden also has the kind of headache, if you will, of having a lot of policy that has not yet taken hold to be tangibly seen in terms of infrastructure or other elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, though certainly he tries to talk about them a lot. We have a fresh question today as to whether or not he'll be trying to talk about that policy and perhaps policy difference with Donald Trump on the debate stage.
Yes, right.
In the future, because President Biden on the Howard Stern show today said he's up for it. This is him earlier today.
Can I tell you a fantasy I had? I don't know if you're going to debate your opponent.
I am somewhere. I don't know when. Yeah. I'm happy to debate him.
And then we heard, Gregory, from Donald Trump outside the courthouse as well as on True Social. True Social, he said anytime, anywhere, any place, even suggested the venue tonight of the courthouse in New York. Is this really going to happen?
I mean, it's sort of remarkable just because in any other election year, the incumbent president saying, of course there's going to be a debate, and his challenger saying, well, of course there's going to be a debate, would not be news because we would just expect that. But we can't expect that this year. The Republican National Committee has an official policy that their party's candidate does not participate in debates. They're sore at the Commission on Presidential Debates for a number of reasons. And then you've had the Biden campaign for months now being non-committal about whether the president will participate. So now we have both candidates on record saying they want to participate in the debate. But, the Trump answer there just sort of underscores the split-screen campaign we've been seeing, in that Trump actually came out and said, look, I'm happy to debate him, but he's got to come to the courthouse in Manhattan because that's where I'm tied up right now, defending myself against criminal charges.
And that's, entertaining. That's a good line. Obviously, he wants to do the whole, why don't you come here and say it's in my face routine because it's Donald Trump. But the fact is, we've had no real conversation about rules around a debate. There's a big preamble that goes into this planning. To your point, they've got a problem with the commission. Gregory, we could really have a campaign with no debates in the end. Isn't that right?
The commission has set the dates and the places for these debates. Yeah. So it's just a matter of the campaign showing up. And by the way, any candidate that gets 15% in the polls can show up. So there's a question of whether Robert F. Kennedy Jr. might be able to cross that threshold and show up. Maybe you'll have 2 out of the 3 there, but not the third. But yes, we're in this phase that the political strategists call the debate about the debates, the meta debates. Because even though we know the time and place, we don't know who the moderator is going to be. they'll negotiate everything down to the length of answers to the height of the podiums on that stage. And there's going to be a lot of reasons why either campaign might eventually back out on short notice, and we may or may not have these debates. It's not a foregone conclusion.
Debate about the debate. Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy, thank you so much for joining us. Plenty to talk about in domestic politics today, but also in geopolitics, as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his way back from China right now following a meeting with President Xi. And the tone was confrontational.
If we don't see a change, we have, in the case of the United States, we've already imposed sanctions on more than 100 Chinese entities, export controls, etc. And we're fully prepared to act, take additional measures, and I made that very clear in my meetings today.
Bloomberg's Megan Scully is joining us now. She leads our congressional coverage, and we were speaking with one of the kind of China hawks in Congress, if you will, yesterday on this program. The ranking member of the China Select Committee, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, was with us, and he was like, this is an area of bipartisanship. Our committee perhaps does the most bipartisan work of any on Capitol Hill right now. Everybody wants to be tough on China, whether it's tech policy and a TikTok divestiture ban or otherwise. When they come back next week, should we expect that China is going to be one of the few areas in this election year that they'll be able to continue to work on?
We're going to see them continue to do things like investigations. I'm not sure how much we're going to see in terms of actual legislation. What happened with TikTok, I think, caught us all by surprise in terms of how quickly it moved through and with tremendous bipartisan support. There's nothing quite in the pipeline like that, but it is still going to be a huge part of the conversation. It is bipartisan. That committee, the China committee, doesn't actually have any direct jurisdiction, unfortunately, for their members. So they don't have a pipeline through which they can funnel out legislation. And we're getting closer to the election, so we're going to see less and less legislation moving. But the campaigns, the presidential campaigns, are trying to outdo themselves in terms of China policy. You know, you have Biden going to the Rust Belt and saying in Pennsylvania, a state that he desperately needs to win, that he would triple tariffs on Chinese steel. And then you have Trump saying that he would put a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods coming into the U.S. So there is bipartisan cooperation, and it's also a hot campaign topic.
You lead our congressional coverage here in Washington, and I'm kind of amazed that we have had such a concerted debate about Ukraine funding and actually Israel funding, with a lot of upset among progressive Democrats. We've spoken really very little about funding for Indo-Pac and specifically Taiwan. We're talking about a lot as TikTok made a lot of news. But the funding for Taiwan elsewhere in these spending bills drew what kind of reaction from Beijing? What kind of a message are we sending there?
Well, I think it's all sort of packaged together in these tensions, right? You know, the tensions with China escalated last year when we shot down the weather balloon, as I'm sure we remember all watching that.
Yes.
And then things have stabilized, but we have had sort of this escalating, you know, because it is a campaign year, because of the money for Taiwan.
Right. It's a statement in itself.
It certainly is, as is the curbs that we're putting on China for producing microchips and importing them. So it's all wrapped into this larger national security debate. Yeah. The attention has been on these other issues, particularly on the tariffs and on TikTok. But I do think that certainly the money for Taiwan is ruffling feathers in Beijing.
Yeah. It's great to have you, Megan. Thanks for joining Megan Scully at the table here for us at Bloomberg. Joining us now as we add another voice to this conversation is Congressman French Hill, the Republican from Arkansas, back with us on Balance of Power. It's great to see you, sir. Welcome back to the conversation. What is the statement in this case that Congress sent to China by approving that money for Taiwan? It's had very little talk compared to more controversial elements in the legislation.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's good to be with you. Yes, these conflicts that the United States finds itself in are interconnected. China's buying 90% of its oil from Iran. Iran takes that money and uses it to support terrorism in Lebanon, Syria, Hamas's attack on Israel, backing the Houthis against international trade. North Korea and China are on the side of Russia in the war in Ukraine. So this is interconnectedness. And that's why I think that the national security bill, Joe, was so important, because it sends the same message to Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow, which is we don't tolerate, and our Western allies don't tolerate, big authoritarian countries invading other nations. And we're going to be in a defensive posture there and provide those nations the weapons, the economic support they need to defeat that sort of threat. And Taiwan is a case in point.
Well, Congressman, you also just raised Ukraine and Russia. Part of this package was not just the $60 billion in aid, but also the Repo Act. And my question to you is, I know you were a big advocate for that legislation, allowing those seized assets to be used to fund Ukraine's war effort or whatever else. But knowing so much of that money is actually in Europe, what actually happens next? How hard is this going to be to get done, especially get done with allies' buy-in as well?
Well, every journey starts with a small step, and it was important for the United States to deliver military certainty and financing, but also economic deterrence in passing the Repo Act and showing Europe a good example of what that statute might look like. Yes, it's true we only have $5 to $7 billion here in the United States of Russian central bank assets, and it's closer to $200 billion in Europe. But just as we were voting to pass that bill here in the United States, the Council of Europe voted unanimously on April 16th to convert frozen Russian assets to a fund for the benefit of Ukraine. So we have advocates on both sides of the Atlantic for this policy.
Congressman, I want to ask you about your role on the Financial Services Committee, about an important issue to us here at Bloomberg. I know it's one to you as well, and that's the prospect of stablecoin legislation emerging. We spoke with Congresswoman Maxine Waters, of course, from your committee, who spoke to the idea of a potential way forward, a path forward that would maybe attach this to the FAA extension bill, if you could come up with a compromise, and also add something called safe banking with that. Here's what she had to say, and we'll have you respond.
It's about making sure that investors and that the people are protected, and that we don't have, a stablecoin bill where people who are, basically the companies don't have the assets that they say that they have. We have to ensure that they have those assets to back up stablecoins. We're on our way to getting a stablecoin bill in the short run.
How short is that run going to be, Congressman? What are you hearing on the committee, and would you vote for it if it was coupled with a cannabis banking bill as well?
Well, Joe, I would vote for it if it were coupled. I have supported the Safe Banking Act for 9 years in Congress now, which would allow cannabis dealers in states where it's legal to have access to the banking system. I think it's a lot easier to catch bad actors and illegal activity if those companies are participating in the banking system. So if someone's trying to take advantage of legal cannabis in an illegal way, it's a lot better to have those companies participating in the banking system. I think Ranking Member Waters is correct that we're very close to completing our bipartisan work together on a payment stablecoin bill that will protect consumers and enhance innovation here in the United States and make the U.S. more competitive. We'll see other countries adopt our rules once we put that law in place. And we're working on it in a bipartisan way as soon as we can to find the floor time and the compromise in both the Senate and the House to move that legislation.
All right, so bipartisan and bicameral. We have less than a minute left with you, Congressman, but is it your understanding that perhaps the easiest vehicle to do this would be the FAA bill?
I think that's a call that leadership has to make. I think there are other ways that we can do it during the course of the year. But if we get an agreement, then House and Senate leadership can work on the best floor strategy for moving the legislation forward. Bottom line is we've made a lot of progress in the last year. Our country will benefit if we can get both these bills passed.
All right, Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, of course, the chair of the subcommittee on digital assets. We appreciate your time, sir, and safe travels back to Washington next week. Now, coming up still, former White House counsel Ty Cobb will join us to break down what we've heard this week in Trump's hush money trial. A lot of testimony over the course of the 4 trial days this week. We'll get his reaction to that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio, live from Washington, D.C. But we want to turn now to what happened up in New York this week and today, as Donald Trump spent another day in the courthouse, where it was day 4 of testimony in his hush money trial. Joining us now for more is Cobb, former federal prosecutor and then special counsel to the president. Ty, always great to have you here on the program. So we've heard from a number of witnesses now, but perhaps the biggest, at least thus far, was David Pecker, who, of course, was the former CEO of American Media, talking about the kind of catch and kill strategy, the defense trying to spin it as him not trying to help Trump politically, but perhaps trying to help the Playboy model Karen McDougal with a reset in her career. What have you made of the testimony we've heard thus far, and whether things are getting easier or more difficult for Trump and his defense team?
This is going to be very difficult for Trump and his defense team. Nice to be with you, Kayleigh and Joe. This is very difficult for them because there's really not much they can dispute in terms of actual events. And frankly, one of the things that Trump does dispute greatly handicaps his lawyers, I think, in terms of their ability to cross-examine the prosecution's witness and to look credible in front of the jury, because Trump insists that they try this case with one arm behind their back, supporting his lie that he didn't have either of these, sexual relationships. Nobody in the world believes that. And it'd be much easier to cross-examine, Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels if you could say, well, that's not really what happened, is it? This happened. And, he doesn't have that option. He's in, total denial, just the way he thought, he won the Supreme Court argument yesterday, notwithstanding the fact that there wasn't a single judge who, is going to accept absolute immunity or the impeachment judgment clause. I mean, he just makes stuff up, and it's his truth. But it's a problem for them litigating this.
Well, Ty, there was some remarkable stories from David Pecker on the stand yesterday as a cross-examination today, but he described a series of meetings that he was brought into, including one at the White House, that President Trump invited him to in 2017, a meeting that included the FBI director, James Comey, that included the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, and other high-ranking officials. You were special counsel to the president. Can you speak to this element of the Trump White House? And were you ever in a meeting with David Pecker?
No, I was never in a meeting with David Pecker. I was in meetings, not many, but I was in a few meetings where I was scratching my head going, why is that person here? It was sort of, Trump had all these, compartmentalized aspects of his life: Bedminster, Mar-a-Lago, New York, Trump Tower, The Apprentice. So he had a lot of visitors, and some of them showed up at unusual places.
Well, and certainly there were those who might be less surprising being in a meeting, like those who actually worked for the White House. There was testimony involving Sarah Huckabee Sanders, for example, as well as Hope Hicks. And we actually were speaking to Palm Beach State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg earlier today, talking about the witnesses we could still hear from. And he was like, it's not going to be Stormy Daniels or even Michael Cohen that ultimately are the real zingers. It's going to be Hope Hicks. And I just wonder what you think about the kind of testimony we could see from her.
Well, I think you see people speculating that she's going to do a mea culpa and not remembering this meeting that she was apparently briefly in, or at least long enough to talk individually to Cohen. But I frankly don't think she's going to be as a consequential witness. I mean, think about what happened today. Last night people are going, Ronna McDaniel, oh my gosh, she knows where all the bodies are buried. This is going to be gangbusters. This will be huge. And they introduced 6 emails and had her talk about her familiarity with Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, and she was on and off in no time.
Pretty remarkable. What should we be looking for next week when it comes time to issue a ruling on the gag order, Ty? We thought we might get this today, maybe yesterday, but there are 5 more now alleged violations according to the prosecution. At some point, the judge is going to have to do something here. And I know we're not putting Donald Trump in jail. So what could be the penalty?
So the penalty is a statutory penalty in New York for these events. $1,000 per violation. And then, in terms of secondary, if there are future violations, the judge has discretion to, do more. I think it's very surprising, frankly, that this judge has not already penalized Trump, $2,000 or $3,000 for a couple of violations, because they're egregious, they're clear violations, and it would present an opportunity to explain to him what the consequences of future violations of that type would be. I think every delay that he interposes in terms of making a decision is an advantage to Trump, and those delays would not be afforded most litigants.
Well, speaking of delays, sir, we'd like to ask you about another case as well, one that is here in Washington and that the Supreme Court was dealing with yesterday, or at least dealing with tangentially, this question around presidential immunity from prosecution in the case brought by Jack Smith here in Washington. The court seemed skeptical of this kind of broad idea of community, but even Chief Justice John Roberts was teasing the idea of perhaps sending this back down to a lower court to really tease out what is an official act and what is not. How do you see this playing out from here? How delayed are we talking this trial here in Washington could be?
So if I can go to 30,000 feet for a second here, the reality is the real delay here was the January 6th committee. They did not share their transcripts or witness interviews with the Justice Department for months, something like 8 months, give or take a month. They had plenty of time to make their ruling, give their findings, make their recommendations, but they had to sit on it because the speaker at the time was adamant that they not issue anything until shortly before the midterms. But for that delay, we'd already be in trial. This has gone from, its first breath to today in 4 months. That's light speed in the legal system, and particularly in the Supreme Court system. I think what happened yesterday, you saw some frustration from Chief Justice Roberts about the fact that the D.C. Circuit, while it issued a ruling that made it very clear that under the existing facts and the existing indictment, there was no immunity. The Supreme Court clearly didn't think that was enough. And not just Roberts. I mean, obviously, that's why they granted cert. They think there has to be a line. They think that they have to craft some guidance for the lower courts in terms of how to apply this in connection with this trial. But I think, as people pointed out yesterday, I mean, almost all the judges, when they tried to be specific about this case, made it very clear they really weren't so much interested in this case, particularly after Sauer, President Trump's lawyer, gave away the farm, acknowledging that virtually all the conduct alleged in the indictment was private acts. So they're not out to help Trump. Not a single thing that they'll write in this opinion will be actually helpful to Trump. The only thing that's helpful to Trump is the delay. And frankly, I think it's a little hyperbolic the way people approach that, because A, it's moving very quickly for a legal matter of this consequence. This is the most important separations of powers case in the history of our country since Marbury versus Madison. It's very difficult to manage that and get it right without going through, some analysis. And it's unfortunate that it will likely, I think, in my view at least, prevent a trial before the election. But it's not surprising given the stakes.
So that would have been my next question, Ty. If this does go back to the appeals court, is it curtains then for this trial, or could Jack Smith still find time to do this, even if it was a President-elect Trump?
So Jack Smith could find the time. Jack Smith would try this, tomorrow night in an alley.
Well, sure he would.
Whether Judge Chuck,
the time,
right? Whether Judge Chuck can give him the time, in good conscience, that'll be the difficult thing. I don't think we're going to have a bunch of, sending it back down and having it come back up. But I think that it's quite likely that, this will be remanded at some point to her, and to parse the issue of separating official acts from purely private conduct. As I said, the president's lawyer did a good job of that yesterday under the withering examination of Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative. She got him to concede that virtually all the conduct in that indictment is private acts. So it's not really a heavy lift, but she's going to be applying a new rule that that the Supreme Court will provide her and provide to the country for the constitutional analysis required should these circumstances ever occur again.
Ty, it's good to see you. Come and pay us a visit next time you're in the Capitol. Ty Cobb, the former special counsel to the president, with us today on Bloomberg as we look ahead to what's coming next in Donald Trump's legal saga. And coming up, a very busy week for him overall as we bring in the voices of our political panel on the legal and political sides of all of this. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino will be here coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I just want to say that I've invited Biden to debate. He can do it anytime he wants, including tonight. I'm ready. Here we are. I invited him to the courthouse that he has us tied up in, his administration. This is all being done through Washington. It's all a well-coordinated attack on a political opponent. But I'm here. I'm ready, willing, and able. And if he wants, I'll do it on Monday night, Tuesday night, or Wednesday night. We'll be in Michigan, a state that he's destroyed.
Former President Trump, of course, as he left court today in Lower Manhattan, wrapping the 8th day of the trial, the 4th day of witness testimony, and our closers are with us now to help us make sense of another doozy of a week. Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital is here. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, political science professor at Iona University. They are Bloomberg political contributors, and great to see you both. Rick, we went from thinking maybe there'd be no debates in the general election campaign to now everybody's a tough guy. Joe Biden is asked about it on Howard Stern today. He indicates he's going to meet him somewhere sometime. Donald Trump says, why don't you come up here to the courthouse? We'll do it tonight. But you have intimate knowledge of how these things are put together. And there's been zero progress on an agreement or any rules in making this happen. Do you think they'll take place?
I think it's a long shot. I mean, we're seeing the debate over debates, right? And,
yes.
and the first one wouldn't be until September anyway, so there's some time to posture, and that's what we're seeing. But I remember the first meeting I had with Bill Clinton's team when Bob Dole was running against Clinton, and we went to see their debate team, and we said, okay, we'd like 3 debates. We'd like them in these states, and, you know, this time. And they're like, oh, we're not prepared to debate you at all. And so we're just getting to that part of the story. Incumbent presidents have all the leverage. They're busy guys. They don't have to debate. Come at me. But like in this case, because of, you know, Trump's bout strength, you know, Biden may be drawn into a debate as a potential, you know, scene setter for a general election that isn't going his way right now. So it's going to be completely a game day decision, right? I mean, they've got the Presidential Commission on Debates that have offered dates and locations, and both campaigns have said that's not really what they want. So we're pretty far away from knowing that there's actually going to be a debate. Wow.
Well, and to Rick's point, Jeannie, on how incumbent presidents usually would have the leverage, it kind of raises the question of whether or not Biden, or perhaps more specifically Biden's campaign, realistically wants to debate or just has to answer the question when asked that, yeah, I would.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. You know, I think Joe Biden feels like he's ready. He's done it before. He would do it again and he would win. You know, so much would have to be worked out before they actually did it. But, you know, he was on Howard Stern. Stern asked him, you know, I'd love to see a debate face to face. He says, of course I will. You know, what's stunning to me is Donald Trump with, you know, the anywhere, anyway, anytime, Monday through Thursday, you know, going on and on. Because, of course, you know, the reality for Donald Trump is he is also a former president. So, you know, he seems very eager to get out there, whereas in Joe Biden's case, I thought he handled it well. He said, yeah, I'll do it. And, you know, we'll see what happens. So it's just fascinating to me how this has taken on a life of its own. And I think Joe Biden got the better of Trump today by, you know, responding like this and getting Donald Trump all heated up on this.
You've actually prepared candidates for these kind of debates. Rick, how do you prepare a candidate to debate Donald Trump, though? I mean, I think maybe you're alluding to a different structure is needed here. Maybe the commission is not the way forward. If these two guys are on the same stage and you need some sort of live fact-checking, that's proven to be impossible, a point that you made earlier. So how do you do it?
Yeah, I think it's campaign malpractice to put a normal person on a stage with Donald Trump, right? Okay. I mean, like, that just doesn't work. Donald Trump is a unguided missile, right? I mean, he can say and do anything on the stage, regardless of what rules have been negotiated or what plan that the network or the commission has in place. So you have to be willing to basically take whatever Donald Trump decides he wants to do. And we've seen it time and time again when CNN or one of these other networks have put him into town halls. You know, he breaks all the rules. He says whatever he wants. There's no fact-checking that's real-time effective. And so I don't know how you do it. I think that you would have to literally stop the debate after every answer that's not factual and say, OK, now we need to tell you what is actually the truth.
Wow.
Now, I don't know anybody wants to watch that debate, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
right. Ratings will be great.
But look, I mean, these are two of the best-known candidates in the history of presidential campaigns. It's not like we're going to find something out in that debate that we didn't otherwise already know. Yeah. So I think there's going to be this look at these and say, they're out of control potential, and it's not good for Biden. Trump, I think, would take any opportunity to throw a haymaker. But remember, he hasn't debated in a long time.
That's right.
And he didn't get any practice during the presidential primary, which is always a good thing to do, even if you're winning. I don't know. I think it's a long shot.
Well, it might be a long shot. It might be messy if it happens, but at least it would be both of them on the same screen when so often these days we're talking about split screens. Even if they're in the same city, they're dealing with completely different situations, Rick. This week, Trump was in court in New York, as we know. Biden was also in New York fundraising, but also they're just down the street for protests at Columbia University that in part has a lot to do with his policies toward Israel. Just speak to how interesting this moment was.
Oh, I think the Manhattan zip code got more action in one day than the country's going to see in the rest of the campaign. I mean, you just think about it. Biden's out there raising money, doing these set events, being presidential, and yet because of his policies, you have this wild, basically semi-riot on the campus of Columbia University that he has yet to really, take as ownership and communicate to young people as to why the administration is doing the things they're doing. And yet, while all that is going on, the good and the bad, you've got Donald Trump sitting in a courtroom listening to what is the most embarrassing situation any human being could ever be in, while all this campaigning is going on, and he's stuck there. And then he comes out, and says, hey, the guy's in my zip code. I'm going to, throw some haymakers and try to get him to debate. Let's go down to, the local Y and see who's there, and we can have a go around. But I've honestly never seen much like this day. I mean, really amazing.
Well, a pretty amazing week all the way around, Jeannie. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as someone who makes a living on a college campus. We saw at least one major graduation canceled this week. Some folks think Columbia might be compelled to do the same as the risers are set up for the graduation ceremony. Should Joe Biden weigh in on that?
I think he's already spoken out, and I think he does need to continue to speak his truth, which is obviously anti-Semitism is not acceptable. We need safety and security. We need to get a ceasefire. We need our hostages home. I would just say, though, on this split screen, where was Joe Biden today? He was comforting the families of 2 police officers in Syracuse, New York, who lost their life in the line of duty, and he was talking about a major investment in chips. That's what a president does. And of course, he's dealing with world events and they have an impact here at home. But that is a far cry from what Donald Trump is doing in Manhattan as he, listens to the stories about porn stars and payoffs and those kinds of things. So, I think if you're from a campaign perspective, you would take Joe Biden's position any day of the week versus where Donald Trump finds himself.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis are going to stick with us because coming up, it's the eve of a big night in Washington. President Biden set to speak at the White House Correspondents' Dinner tomorrow. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Well, Well, tomorrow night, SNL's Colin Jost is set to host the White House Correspondents' Dinner here in Washington. We'll get a quick thought on that now from our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. Jeannie, it's not just Colin Jost that we'll be hearing from tomorrow. President Biden is set to speak as well, maybe try to crack some jokes for a president who's always questioned around his stamina and wherewithal. How important is a night like this for him?
It's very important. I think he'll pull out those Brandon glasses again, maybe. He'll definitely have some self-deprecating jokes, I think one thing I'll be watching for, and is the issue of any protests. That's been a key concern of the campaign and the president as they've gone across the country. So whether that comes up is a big, big question. But I think it is a time for him to, sort of make light of so many things that are, truly a concern to voters like his age. And I think he'll roast the press as they usually do as well.
This can be a high-risk environment, depending on who you're talking to. You know Joe Biden. He likes to have a laugh.
He likes to have a laugh, and I agree with Jeannie. I think it could be a big protest because I think the entire New York Times table could turn around and give him his backside because he won't do a private interview with them. So I think that could be the biggest thing that happens at the event.
Oh, gosh, if that's the case, we'll have to ask him for our own interview, I guess.
I guess so.
Fascinating conversation, as always, with Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. I hope we have some fun stuff to share with you following the big weekend on Monday. Great panel. Thank you both for being here. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you back here on Monday. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.